Okay, hello everyone and welcome back to Always Watching. Today we're discussing the National Geographic documentary, The Mission, currently streaming on Hulu and Disney+. So briefly, The Mission unpacks the life of John Chau, an American missionary who is killed while attempting to make contact with an indigenous group off the coast of India. So the documentary relies heavily on John's journals and a number of archival footage. So I think it's an incredibly well done, thoughtful documentary that not only unpacks John's life, but the sort of fanatical evangelical beliefs that make individuals susceptible to developing a messiah complex. So I learned about John when he was killed by the Sentinelese, and at the time there was a lot of conversation. Some people believe he died a martyr, whereas other people believe that this was a textbook case of flying way too close to the sun, the arrogance, the audacity. The documentary tries to give you context and look at things from a wider lens. And as well-intentioned as I believe he was, I think he is a cautionary tale about how the colonial mentality has evolved. In the beginning, the intention was to civilize, like the idea that people existed in these remote places as sort of blank slates, waiting to be saved, right? Waiting to be brought into the light. And this sort of imagery of the barbarian has evolved and become romanticized, right? Like now these people who live in remote places, you know, individuals who exist outside of time, outside of space, they need to be protected at all costs. And this is actually far more insidious because this impulse to protect, this humanitarian desire to save can actually justify basically violating individuals and communities. I think what makes John's story terrifying is that so many more people now know about the Sentinelese, and so many more people will probably attempt to make contact, but perhaps a little more aggressively next time. The documentary unpacks John's life through his journals and through voice actors, like they kind of narrate his journals, and I felt this was a very effective way, allowing the audience not to pass judgment right away. John's susceptibility to missionary work came early in life when he was just a child. He would basically consume novels about adventure, about exploration, about missionary work. The problem is many of these stories basically revolved around an explorer trying to either enlighten or survive the indigenous people they had come in contact with. John's dream at a very young age was basically to live as a wild man. Like, so he was very much dedicated to finding his purpose. Like he would ask God, like, what am I supposed to do? Where am I supposed to be? Like, help me out. While researching unreached people, he came across the Sentinelese and he essentially became obsessed with them and just could not stop thinking about them. And one of the most dangerous or violent colonial beliefs is that because there exists places without religion, these places are also devoid of God and therefore all humanity. John's mission was not only to make contact, but it was to successfully convert them. And if need be, I guess stay there and live there indefinitely. And his default assumption is that could be a possibility, right? Like he never assumes that whatever he's bringing into their community could actually result in their extinction. He believed that if he was successful, this would be the greatest missionary achievement of all time. And I think sometimes in wanting to fulfill your purpose, especially when it's related to God or religion, people sometimes think I have to do the most dangerous thing ever or something that's never been done in order to really prove my love. And that's incredibly misguided. So John is not the first person to attempt to contact the Sentinelese, and the documentary interviews people who were successful and people who were unsuccessful. So briefly, the Sentinelese live on North Sentinel Island. This is part of the Andaman Islands. These islands were actually shown in King Kong and basically are more or less from the Western vantage point like the heart of darkness, right? This is a place where no humanity exists. Part of the seduction in wanting to come in contact with the Sentinelese is because no one's ever done it before. Like anything that can be conquered has been conquered, And even though feats like climbing Mount Everest or doing dangerous things, it is an accomplishment. It's just not newsworthy. So nothing compares to coming in contact with people that nobody has ever come in contact with before. So the Sentinelese are often seen as people who have never had any sort of relationship with the outside world, but this is actually false. The first known history of the Andaman Islands was actually documented by a man named Maurice Vidal Portman in 1880. Portman, there's actually a very interesting Twitter thread that basically outlines his life, and he comes from a very wealthy family. He was the black sheep of the family, and he was a bit of a creep. Like, he was officer in charge of the Andamanese, which probably had to be the worst position at that time. You see, a picture speaks, I think, 1,000 words. Some of the photographs that he would capture of the Andamanese were quite unsettling. Like, they show them being measured, being probed, being prodded, and it's unclear how many died in the interest of science, but it's very obvious from these photographs that he had some sort of sick fascination with their bodies. In his account, he actually writes, as long as these people were not interfered with, they would survive, and their vitality is entirely dependent on remaining untouched. The documentary interviews a historian by the name of Adam Goodhart, and he also basically discusses his misguided attempts to contact the Sentinelese, but he learned quite quickly that this was dangerous and he retreated. And what I find fascinating is that John never comes to this realization, or if he did, it was too little too late. And that's because he really believed that he was destined to be the one to bring Christianity to the Sentinelese successfully. A part of the radical evangelical belief is that in order for Jesus to return, everyone must be exposed to the gospel, and anyone not exposed to the gospel will be sentenced to hell. And this is a very white savior complex. Like, if God created me the same as you, who are you to say where God is or isn't? Of course, traditionally, missionaries have been used as kind of a mechanism of control to indoctrinate and control people. And what I find kind of terrifying also about John is that he wasn't ignorant. A lot of his friends interviewed in the documentary basically tell us that he was very aware of the colonial history of the missionaries. And he did wonder if a lot of what he was doing was kind of just mirroring their behavior. Soon as John found out about the Sentinelese, he spent his whole life basically dedicated to preparing for this trip. And it's really unfortunate because he was a true explorer. He rock climbed, he was a marathon runner, he was super certified. If there's anyone that could live in the wild, it was him. The problem with it was that all this preparation was for this trip, right? It wasn't really to carve out, an alternative path. And it seems like from this documentary, he met a lot of amazing people and he had a lot of amazing experiences, but he couldn't really enjoy any of it. This was not someone living for his purpose, nor was he someone living for Jesus. And I think when you're so focused on the outcome and you have such a clear ending in your head, it's always destined to fail. And one of the ways that the documentary makes this point is by sort of paralleling his story with a man named Daniel Everett. And Daniel Everett was low-key probably the best part of this documentary. He was an individual, a missionary who spent 30 years in the Amazon in Brazil trying to convert this tribe to Christianity, and of course he was unsuccessful. And he had gone out of his way, he had learned their language, and after kind of failing to convert them, he left a totally changed man. Not only did he lose his faith, but he strongly believes that missionary work should actually not be allowed, and is incredibly destructive, right, and has the potential to cause extinction. Daniel, like John, went to Brazil with this white savior complex, this idea that he had all this knowledge and there was these people just waiting to be enlightened by him. However, the more he tried to explain his religion, the less they wanted anything to do with it, right? What he felt was evidence was not really evidence for them. And again, he had this belief that he had so much to offer, but not once did he ask himself, what could he learn from these people, right? What am I here to actually receive? And as disappointed as he was, I actually do think he fulfilled his purpose. And I found him to be a very thoughtful and reflective individual, because I think finding your purpose, I get it, you want it to be tied into helping people, giving, But sometimes we don't think maybe our purpose is to receive information. And the problem with this finding your purpose, especially if very much revolved around, wanting to make a difference and helping people, is that you can end up attributing more power to yourself than you actually have. And I think that's where John crossed the line. He really think he had power over the outcome. It's not just a power thing. Like, in addition to this, I think the issue, and I think John's journey demonstrated this well, is that sometimes we assume we have more knowledge than we actually do. And if anything, John's journey illustrates that we have so much more to learn. And again, we don't know as much about the world as we would like to believe. One of the things about evangelical Christians is that they very much criticize, regular Christians as performative, like they're not really dedicating themselves to God. But the other extreme is also performative, right? This idea that I'm so dedicated to God that I'm going to live my life trying to convert these people is equally devoid of meaning, right? Like in Daniel's case, actually, his experience not only alerted him to his own ignorance, kind of alerted him to the religious and sort of political system in place. It enables people to kind of violate these communities and actually contribute to their existence. And one of the points that I'm very happy the documentary outlines is how National Geographic is very much a part of this kind of very, very violent history. The documentary uses a lot of archival footage, and it's really, a lot of these National Geographic documentaries show people from these remote islands as not just savages, but people just like as if their minds were blank slates. Kind of like infantilize these people, and they make it seem like there's just nothing, right? As if the white man had brought all this innovation, all this knowledge that they were just waiting for, that would just automatically improve their life. And the way the indigenous populations were often portrayed is that they know nothing about the outside world, right? And not only do they not know anything about the outside world, they don't know anything about their own communities, right? Like as if they themselves are a blank slate, not just as individuals, but as a people, waiting to be given meaning, waiting to be labeled, waiting to be examined, waiting to be probed by National Geographic. And so National Geographic, they kind of took a turn and turned it, like they started to romanticize people. And this is also equally destructive, because when you romanticize a remote place, right, like when you have these white men coming in, being worshipped because of their technology, being kissed, being hugged, it gives viewers the impression that we just saved people from extinction, right? It's very flattering to the audience watching. And again, it creates this kind of insidious humanitarian impulse to want to save people by actively violating them in every way. Andamanese for a long time were basically considered to be cannibals, even though there was no evidence of that. And some of the most famous photographs of the Andamanese basically show them like with bows and arrows and, this kind of menacing image of people ready to fight and ready to kill. But of course, context is important. And the anthropologist that actually took these photographs is interviewed, and turns out he took many more photographs, and a lot of them smiling, a lot of them showing the Sentinelese in a more like favorable light. But of course, that doesn't sell as well as people from a remote island we know nothing about trying to kill us. One of the points the anthropologist makes is that violence isn't just physical, it's also like in the language and in the pictures and the way you kind of portray people. So in the case of the Sentinelese, a lot of the images that John had in his head were very much of people that were defensive for no reason. And again, these people are not blank slates, right? They're defensive for a reason. And that is because they're very much aware of what happened to other tribes around them. They're very much aware of their history, and they know that not only do foreigners bring disease, but they bring ill intent. Although John doesn't bring medicine and he doesn't bring technology, he brings the Bible. I think his obsession with the Sentinelese was very much self-serving, because again, he had this childhood dream of one day wanting to live in the wild. So it's like, okay, well, if I can live in the wild and save people from damnation, that would be ideal. And I think some part of him on a deep level understood how a lot of what he was doing was mostly for himself and not necessarily for the church. One of the most telling things about John is how he clearly saw himself as like a catalyst for change. Like he would ask other people to help him, but it was very clear that he thought he was he would be the reason. And his plans never really revolved around bringing people, right? Like there were no anthropologists. he never really goes out of his way to try and, have this expedition to go there. Like, it's very much like him going there and reaping the rewards. Like, in his journal, he outlined several versions of what could possibly take place. And and they kind of read like a comic book. Like, the idea that you're going to sit there cross-legged and these people are just going to come to you. They don't know what you're talking about, but I guess somehow they're going to accept you is just wild. John had consumed so much content to the point where he never once questions the sort of integrity of the people attempting these missions, right? Like, anybody trying to make contact or expose people to the gospel must by default, they must have had good intentions at the very least. And again, I think some part of him knew that they probably didn't, but he never really questioned it, right? And watching his preparation was really interesting because he wasn't prepared at all, right? Like, it never occurs to him that he could be bringing diseases. There's really no precaution taken, right? Like, as to maybe why they would be defensive, how his presence there could very much endanger them. Like, he assumes that worst case scenario, his presence can only make things better, which is just like classic white savior complex. Fortunately, John's life, like, the crazy part is the first time he attempted to contact them, he was shot. And the second time, he was killed. And there's a brilliant line in the documentary, like, the people who live by the bow and arrow, they don't miss, right? It's like, from their perspective, we tried to warn you, you keep coming back, you're spewing gibberish that we probably heard before. And so from their perspective, like, this person very much poses a danger, and they had every right to kill him. And his body was actually never recovered, which is really terrifying because it's just way too dangerous for anyone to go there. And so his death just sparked all kinds of controversy. And one of the most telling scenes is when a friend of his, a pastor, is speaking to his congregation and basically telling them, like, how we should all be like John and how this is the level of dedication it will take to essentially bring, I guess, light into dark places. But at the end of the day, John just saw these people basically, from my perspective, John saw North Sentinel Island as a stage for him to, recreate these fantasies. But unfortunately, fantasy is not a reality. And one of the questions he repeatedly asks in his journal is like whether or not this is Satan's last stronghold. And I just thought that was wild because the idea that anyone not exposed to the gospel is automatically going to hell is so draconian. And it kind of strips people of their humanity because it's not that they're living on an island. It's not that they're living by the bow and arrow. It's because they haven't been exposed to the Bible, right? Like, that's the reason that they're going to hell. And where John went wrong is that he was so focused on the outcome. The difference between wanting to be a part of something and wanting to be the reason for it. And he very much wanted to reap the rewards. And in the end, the outcome is not with us, right? You can do your best, but this outcome might never be achieved in our lifetime. And I think that's the line between like faith and madness, knowing what you don't know. And so overall, I highly recommend this documentary. You guys let me know what you think, and until next time.